made everything up. Blah. We'll have the details when we do the numbers. Sometimes capitalism can do what democracy can't, and that's what's happening with global warming. The White House is opposed to limits on greenhouse gases. The president says they might drag down the economy. But it seems every week there's a new business group or trade coalition announcing its support for a federal cap on carbon dioxide emissions. Today, it was electricity suppliers. We asked Sam Eaton from the Marketplace Sustainability Desk to look into it.
The Electric Power Supply Association announced today that it's calling for mandatory federal limits on greenhouse gas emissions. The trade group's members account for more than a third of the U.S.'s power generation. The group's president, John Schelk, says the reason they're endorsing CO2 regs is simple: predictability.
Any power plants built in the near future that are being planned for now will be around for literally decades, as long as 50 years. So it's important to know ahead of time what the rules will be governing those power plants, including the rules on greenhouse gas emissions.
Schelk also says recent state actions to curb carbon emissions are creating a patchwork of regulations, which are difficult for big electricity suppliers to navigate. He says federal action would eliminate that. But Billy Pizer with the Washington research group Resources for the Future says there's another reason so many corporations are throwing their support behind a federal CO2 cap. They see it as inevitable.
For people in the electric power industry, this is legislation or regulation that's going to have a significant impact on their operations, and they do not want to be left out of the negotiation.
The Electric Power Supply Association joins the ranks of corporations calling for limits on greenhouse gas emissions. Even oil giant ExxonMobil is softening its stance. But Pizer says the growing unity in corporate America has a soft underbelly: the details. He says the more diverse the coalition, the less likely it is they'll agree on how a federal carbon cap should be implemented. And that's a hint of the real battle still ahead, the one that'll take place on Capitol Hill. In Los Angeles, I'm Sam Eaton for Marketplace.
Europe moved another step ahead of the United States in fighting climate change today. Regulators proposed new rules to cut carbon dioxide from cars 20% over the next 5 years.
Seriously,
the U.S. doesn't even have CO2 limits for its cars, which is part of the reason Americans produce almost a quarter of the world's greenhouse gases. Commentator Robert Reich offers this suggestion about how to cut back.
You can forget a carbon tax anytime soon. Democrats don't have the intestinal fortitude or the votes to enact it. That leaves the only plausible political alternative right now: subsidizing the development of non-fossil-based fuels. Yet there's no money in the public kitty for this. Bush's new budget allows only a pittance for new research in solar, biomass, wind, and other alternatives. Even if the Democrats wanted to spend more, they'd have to take it from somewhere else in a budget that's already tight. So the question is where to get the money for alternative energy. The answer is, at least partly, from the revenues we consumers have been handing oil companies. For the last few years, as oil prices shot upward, America's largest oil companies reaped a bonanza. Essentially, it's been a gigantic transfer of money from Americans who use oil to oil companies and their shareholders. ExxonMobil reports an annual profit of $39.5 billion for 2006, its second consecutive record and the largest profit reported by any American company in history. Other oil companies are also swimming in cash. And it doesn't look like the bonanza will end anytime soon. Oil prices are rebounding now that cold weather has returned to most of the nation. The Democrats should propose a temporary windfall profits tax on oil companies. Temporary, that is, until the oil companies' current oil earnings boom falls back to a normal range. The proceeds would go into a fund to finance R&D in non-fossil-based fuels. Market fundamentalists who holler that oil companies should be allowed to reinvest their profits in new oil exploration aren't paying attention to the environmental costs. But the windfall tax should be designed so that, to the extent oil companies do wish to invest in non-fossil-based fuels, such profits are exempt. It's a no-brainer. Oil companies are in the money. We gave it to them because there are no competitive non-fossil alternatives. It makes sense to use those extra profits to create those alternatives.
Robert Reich is a professor of public policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He used to be the Secretary of Labor for President Clinton. Share your thoughts with us about what you hear on the program. Our website is marketplace.org. The government hasn't been able to figure out health care. Companies are pushing costs onto their workers. Consumers are trying to cope with rising bills and copays. It sounds for all the world like an invitation to a marriage of convenience. And that's where Walmart and organized labor found themselves today in Washington. Nancy Marshall-Genzer explains.
Walmart CEO Lee Scott rubbed shoulders with union presidents this morning to announce an unusual alliance on health care. He says businesses can't foot the health care bill anymore and be competitive. Scott was short on details, but did say something like universal health care would go a long way toward solving the problem.
I do like the fact that worldwide we are able to sell for less and that health care is off the table.
The group did state that every American must have affordable health insurance. Afterwards, former Clinton Chief of Staff John Podesta shared ideas on just how everyone could be insured.
Whether that takes the form of expanded Medicare and Medicaid, people need access to group coverage.
And that could happen with Democrats controlling Capitol Hill. Service Employees International Union President Andy Stern tested the waters last week at a Democratic congressional retreat.
And I encouraged them and told them this is the moment to do something about health care. They all stood up and applauded, and now they're going to get a chance.
Stern and his unlikely bedfellows will be lobbying Capitol Hill, and they plan a national summit in May. In Washington, I'm Nancy Marshall-Genzer for Marketplace.
Not far from where Andy Stern and Lee Scott were talking about health care as the most pressing domestic issue, Congress was talking about foreign affairs, foreign investment in U.S. companies specifically. If the phrase Dubai Ports World rings a bell with you, that's what the White House Financial Services Committee was considering today. After that firm from the United Arab Emirates tried to buy some U.S. port operations from a British company, there were no less than 20 bills introduced in Congress to restrict foreign investment. None of them passed, so now the House is taking up a compromise measure that would give lawmakers more control over how foreign deals are approved. David Marchek is a foreign investment analyst.
I don't want lawmakers to approve deals. One of the biggest problems with the Dubai Ports case was that Congress was blindsided by it. They had no idea the transaction was coming, and they weren't briefed until it broke in the newspaper. That created a witch's brew in the Congress. This bill gives Congress much more visibility into the foreign investment review process.
An official from the Treasury Department told the committee today its bill would cause more delays in approving foreign deals, though there are some U.S. business groups that do support the proposal. Despite the news over the weekend bird flu has been found in British turkeys, there is still no sign of a pandemic among humans. It's back in the news today because Indonesia has stopped sharing its samples of the virus with the World Health Organization. Indonesia's had the most bird flu deaths, so the WHO is anxious to get its hands on their samples. Instead, the country's health ministry signed an agreement with an international drug company. Helen Palmer reports now from the Marketplace Health Desk at WGBH.
Top of the list of those worried by Indonesia's move to hold back samples is the World Health Organization itself.
We're very concerned about this development.
That's the WHO's Dick Thompson. The organization gives genetic samples to virologists who track changes in the deadly H5N1 virus. And it is changing, says Stephen Morse. He's an epidemiologist at Columbia University's School of Public Health.
We've been able to determine, for example, that there are 3 separate subgroups of H5N1. So the subgroup in Vietnam is different from the one in Indonesia.
The Indonesian strain's the deadliest. 63 of the 81 cases have died. Indonesia's health ministry says the deal with drug company Baxter International will ensure prompt access to any H5N1 vaccine. It says Asia's supplied the West with flu strains free for 50 years, yet can't afford annual flu vaccines.
Hello, this is Dwayne. Oh, hi, how are you doing today? I'm doing all right.
driving back into the city from Walnut Creek.